Hi, my name is Greg Lehman. Welcome to Moonbeams. Today, my guest is Colby Cotton. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Greg, great to be here.
Thanks so much for joining me. Cool, cool. Well, jumping right in here, we had some great conversation earlier about, James Tate, Black Mountain Poets. I know it's going to be, the first of many conversations we're probably going to have being LA based here. But we'll jump into the questions here and see where the conversation goes. What is exciting you most about poetry at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question, Greg. I feel like, when I first, started turning over this question, I was like, wow, what a kind of absurd position to begin with, because
Yeah.
I feel like there's so much to my mind, despair right now. And I really appreciate just putting back in that headspace of like, what am I finding joy in? And what excites me? And I think when I think back through, what's been bringing me joy lately is what it has always been, and that is that sense of discovery that I'm still finding in poetry. I haven't been writing all that long. It's been about, 9, almost 10 years. But what excites me now is what excited me when I first started getting into the poetry game. Um, I feel as if that we're writing in a time when there is an absolute abundance of poets and poetry and events. We were talking before about we were talking about the Ice Out of LA reading at Beyond Baroque on Wednesday. We were talking, you're kind of putting me on to some other readings that I'm like, man, Greg and I live in the same town. I don't know what's going on in my own backyard. And it feels really exciting to me to engage with these kind of poetic ecosystems and both old and new. I was last summer, I was at the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and three poets that kept coming up over and over again, independently of each other were Yusef Komunyakaa, Louise Glück, and Jack Gilbert. And the first two weren't all that surprising to me, and I was enthusiastically, jumping into those conversations. Like Yusef Komunyaka's Neon Vernacular and Dian Kaido and all of his other work have just been like biblical to me over the years. And Louise Glick, before she was my teacher at the Stegner Fellowship, I had come across Aboriginal landscape very early in my introduction to poetry, so to speak, and has from that moment to now has shown me the odd, strange possibilities that poetry can offer. And I was like, Failing and Flying to me by Jack Gilbert is, it's a top 20 poem for me. I love it, but I've never been like, totally captivated by the broader work. And, I can feel like the hisses and the boos coming right now. But my roommate at Breadloaf and my workshop leader are like, no, you got to go back. You got to read it again. And I went home and I still still haven't found myself in those poems quite yet. But I'm always thinking of, Mark Strand was talking about Wallace reading Stevens and saying, there's still some poems that he didn't understand, and talking about as a reader and as a poet that, poems will reveal themselves to you in time, and they may not always be present. So, yeah, I've just been totally thrilled by the number of poets that are out there doing it, the willingness and the openness of major journals and institutions to, meet the moment, so to speak. And I feel like everywhere I go, whether it's Los Angeles, New York, North Carolina, anywhere in the country, it feels like people are just turning me on to new poets and old and new. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, what a great takeaway, especially speaking to our time when there is such need for um, expression, when people don't really know what to make of their situation and respond in beautiful, creative ways in any number of mediums, but especially in poetry. And I can't let it go. You had Louise Glick as an instructor.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have anything to share to speak to that question as well, or any other, takeaways you'd like to share from learning about.
Yeah, absolutely. We could fill a whole other conversation with her and that experience. But you know, we we met at the Stanford would rent a place for her each year, to my understanding, the same house in Berkeley. So it was a better commute from Oakland to there than from Oakland to Stanford. I'll tell you that. Uh, and she was interesting in that, I had Eavan Boland before her, the workshop previous to that quarter, and Evan was much more willing, I think, and to be oracular. And I felt like I had all these questions, and she had all these answers. And Louise really prioritized the page, and she really instilled in all of us that feeling of an involuntary inevitability in our poetry, and and the occasions in which we'd kind of goad her out and into these wider conversations about being a poet in the world, kind of brings me back to that excitement of the current moment. And um in that, someone had asked her, I can't remember who, something about like professional advice of some variety, and she said, like, you have to understand that, when I was first started writing and when I was first coming up, there weren't a lot of poets out there. And I think that that's something that, I've been, continuously grateful for in a lot of ways. And that, there's this, I keep repeating the word ecosystem. There's a wide ecosystem out there of all sorts of different shapes and varieties. And that, I think I've heard, some, I guess valuable criticism of writing right now, of being, like, why aren't people reading Galway Canal? And why aren't people talking about this type of, French repeating forms or something? And it reminded me of a workshop too, where, we went around the table and we're kind of talking about, our poetic lineage, so to speak. And someone had said something along the lines of, I don't have a historical example for what I do. And to me, that speaks entirely to what I'm excited about right now, and that, this isn't, a vertical generation of poets looking necessarily to the past. And I think that's part of the reason why you see so many people, looking horizontally and looking to each other for where to go next and what's valuable and what's not. And, time will sort it all out.
Yeah, yeah, and that speaks to me of somebody who's not derivative. That's somebody that is making it their own, and
Yeah.
speaking to a time unlike any other, but also like so many other times. So wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And this dovetails very well into my next question. Which poets were most impactful in getting you to become a poet?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think a couple of years ago, I might have just like rattled off like a bunch of poets and poems that I really love and that I remember as being important. But maybe it's me being a bit removed from like the workshop, and me, being a teacher myself right now, and that, I can name, like Skunk Hour by Lowell and For the Last Wolverine by James Dickey were both, like really generative poems for me and early on. But I think that really for me, that I was really fortunate, and I feel continuously lucky to have had just awesome, awesome teachers, and to have given me like had really given me a poetic, you know, um, boot camp early on. My first teachers were this great poet named Juliana Gray, and a nonfiction writer, Susan Morehouse. And, they had introduced me to, Andrew Hudgens' After the Lost War and Ecstatic in the Poison. Bellocs Ophelia by Natasha Trethewey was really important. And they kind of directed me off to Greensboro, North Carolina, where I studied with Stuart Deschel and Ansel Elkins, and read a lot more James Dickey, like I mentioned before, for The Last Wolverine. I don't know how helpful or generative that is to me now, but I remember that filling me with a sense of, capaciousness and poetry, and, you know, uh, a rhythm that, you know, was more important than logic in some ways at that time. But um, And then later on, I had Ken Fields and Patrick Phillips, Eavan Boland, and Louise Glück at Stanford. And all of those poets collectively, I feel like they were able to both, slap my hands when I needed it, but also to be prescriptive with what I was reading or who I might read or who I might find interesting, and cultivating a voice that isn't just, you know, rooted in a solitary poem, but a voice that can speak across a body of work. And I think that's what we are talking about, before with Tate and others. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about our conversation before I started recording as you were talking about that, about how like, in the moment, it would be interesting to see how much attention is given by an artist. Like, this is what my voice is now, it will become something,
Yeah.
if there's even any awareness or even any concern there.
Mhm.
But then it's like, I doubt any animal thinks about what fossil they're going to be, after it's been petrified and everything
Right.
like that, So like there's a mystery there and hopefully there's some self-awareness there. But like, but you're also describing like, it stood out to me how you were saying like you were concentrated on like a rhythm and a form and not as much, I think you used the word sense or
Yeah, yeah, I created like there's and Philip Levine wrote a book of essays that are kind of autobiographical called The Bread of Time, and he talks about having Lowell and Berryman at Iowa and finding Lowell like bored by them all by him and everyone else, but something that he said that I believe it was Lowell that said, it's really hard to keep the rhythm and make sense at the same time. And I think so much of, especially early on, and I'm trying to keep reminding myself of this as I, continue through the years here, is, still having that attenuation to the ear and the music of it. But something that, Evan Boland said in our workshops about, constructing yourself as a poet that, is going to last, is she was talking about voice, and that, she goes, no award, no book prize, uh, no trophy is ever going to bestow the title of poet upon you. And she said that you can open any um, leading literary magazine in America and you will find a dazzling poem in there, but their voice will not or may not come forward as a poet. And you know, I was, zero at the bone hearing this, but I think that these are kind of the lessons that, I was kind of talking about that, perhaps I should be in therapy for, but, but have, you know, been instructive for me well beyond that time.
yeah, yeah, and in the craft, letting that voice find itself
Yeah.
in the practice, in the rhythm of producing and in the rhythm of fostering something that you don't see. Like, people do default to the analogy of the marathon over,
Hmm.
the mile or whatever. And which also fosters like further love of the growth you find in continuing that lifestyle and producing work.
Yeah, we were talking before, you and I were talking before about, opening up Charles Wright's Collected and seeing um, how the form that we know him to have, and if you saw it anywhere, you'd be like, oh, there's Charles Wright. He doesn't really come to that form for at least 10, 20 years of writing, and that can be a little scary to be a little early in your career and be like, well, I haven't found my where I'm going yet, but we'll arrive where we're supposed to, I guess.
Absolutely. Love that. Yeah, and drafting from there, if you could change something about how culture views poetry today, what would it be?
Yeah. I guess this isn't much of a new idea, but I feel like there's not like a cultural imagination for where poetry should and could exist. Um, my friend was just, traveling, and he sent me a picture to our Pobro group chat, about where he was in the Minneapolis airport, and Milkweed has their poetry books there, and I was like, God dang, like why doesn't every airport have a poetry section? People are so profoundly bored in these places. I don't think that, I think that people, I really believe that people would, might just pick up a book of poetry and, no matter how they're reading it or and to what degree they're engaged with it, I would flip through it on a plane at least. I mean, if you're watching um, Elves from the Doom House 7 on a plane, I feel like whatever, that poetry belongs there too. I did a reading, excuse me, I did a reading last year downtown at Night Gallery, and I arrived just kind of thinking that it'd be like the usual, like kind of semi-pitiful crowd that poetry can bring, especially when you don't know what's going on.
Sure.
And I was just like immediately nervous because there's a metric ton of people there, and I've always been curious about that missed opportunity between galleries and poetry and fiction readings. That I went to a small like art school, visual art school in upstate New York, and there'd always be in college there'd be these great little openings for art, and it was like right when I was coming up with a conception and knowledge of what a poetry reading even was, and I was like, what the heck, this is like the perfect place to have a poetry reading and support the arts. But uh, perhaps they know that poets can't afford the art on the walls. I think too, something that I think too about, when I lived in New York, I hope that they're still doing it. The poetry broadsides, I guess, I don't know if you call them broadsides, but the poetry in the subway cars. And I feel like poets can be a little guilty of this. Like, I mean, I believe me, I went to the bar some night and was just like, can you believe that awful poem that was on the subway today? Like, this is what's represented. And I'm like, and I have to check myself a little bit because I'm like, well, what do you want? Do you want poetry to be read? And I think too of when I was in Greensboro, there's a wonderful bookstore called Scuppernong Books in downtown Greensboro. And it was the first bookstore I ever went into, and I'm sure there's more, and I hope there is, where the poetry section was front and center. And you had to kind of ignore or actively ignore the poets and the poetry in order to get to the other sections of the bookstore. And, I really think that there's also another maybe missed opportunity with Barnes and Noble to move that out of the cobwebby corners and into the aisles. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's where we get, the algorithms do great things at times. And in my last interview today, like I was talking about just the double-edged sword of social media, in that like
Yeah,
we are seeing more coverage for poets. More people are writing
yeah,
poetry because they're seeing it more and everything like that. But it also just reward like whatever got views, that's what gets the money. That's why you see like pop fiction at the airport because it's selling because it's there. And like there's
yeah,
that cycle, so like to be brave and to try to bring something forward is something I would love to see too in poetry. And I think it's upon poets, and then also just to underline like, seeing bad poetry, seeing bad art at all, it's like people are making art, people are getting their art out there, and like, am I putting forward the energy to encourage that, or am
yeah.
I tearing someone down? I know what I'm going to opt for.
Yeah, and like, and also, I mean, this is a development of taste, right?
Sure.
You got to start somewhere. And this is how, if it's, I can, dunk on any number of Instagram poets where people are just chopping up sentences. But I mean, but if this is what gets people through the door, I mean, I think that I don't know. To me, I'm happy to check myself a little bit more and let it in. Yeah.
Yeah, 1,000%. And I try to be that for everybody, like get them in here. It's not up to me to be a gatekeeper. I don't like gatekeepers, so yeah, get them all in. Yeah. Beautiful. So, with that, switching to the word association here. You ready to rock?
Well, let's do it.
Okay. Pros,
Poetry.
anchor,
Man.
lobster,
Bisque.
net,
Worth.
semester,
Quarter.
saddle,
Flour.
grade,
Inflation.
Student,
diction,
checker,
print,
hope.
despair.
Awesome. You did great.
I feel like I'm just finishing your words.
Was it Blower? Would you say?
I was so self-conscious there. I was like, I just keep saying, he keeps saying, and I just kind of just adding on what he's to the word or phrase, and it's not really honoring the intention of the experiment here. But so I was like, oh, I guess I'll just say flower because I'm looking out my window right now, and there's a flowering tree.
This is a place for dishonor. I love it. Yeah, make it your own. But very cool. And then yeah, so would love for you to share a remarkable line that you came across. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just our conversation about the algorithm and what it feeds us is really front of mind for me here, and that it's not a new idea to say that we're living in like a time of complete uncertainty, and in so doing, it's like a lot of other times in history. Although I think that, and perhaps this has been true throughout history too. It wouldn't surprise me, but I also feel that the algorithm also, amplifies people's convictions, and there's certain, and in some ways, like somewhat, I guess, ironically, like a certainty that comes from, I'm guilty of it myself, and friends and family will say like, oh, the Democrats should be doing this, or what you should be eating is that, and if you're on this side of town, you should be eating at this restaurant and order this and order that. And to me, um, it kind of continuously breeds more. I guess this is the point: is to breed more anxiety and more, despair within me, because I don't feel as if I ever have any clear answers about anything. And then as poets, we know that the poem comes out of, and often, if not always, comes out of a form of uncertainty, that we don't know where this comes from or that comes from. And one of my teachers, Eavan Boland, said, I'm going to paraphrase her poorly again, but she said that a poem is a very fragile vessel to put our feelings into and to put our ideas into. And she said that, and I've internalized this for better or worse, that the poem is not a mode of expression; it's a form of experience, and that the act of the poem and making the poem is to finish an unfinished experience. But something that I've been really wrestling with, and is when you're left in this perpetual state of uncertainty and not knowing, it gives me some real trepidation within my own work, and I open a journal, that sometimes people are able to very eloquently say, who or what or how something happened or who hurt them and the ways in which it was done. And, I find myself envious of certainty. And, I've been thinking a lot about making poems and reading poems and trying to track them down where there is this degree of not knowing. And the poem that I find myself turning to over and over and over and over again throughout the years for various reasons, but lately this is a poem called "Looking West from Laguna Beach at Night" by Charles Wright. And I was hoping that you'd indulge me. I don't know if, I'm sure we're over time, but if you'd indulge me reading it, it's not that long.
This is Colby time. Yes, please. Yeah.
Good. You'll regret saying that. Looking west from Laguna Beach at night. I've always liked the view from my mother-in-law's house at night. Oil rigs off Long Beach, like floating lanterns out in the smog-dark Pacific. Stars in the eucalyptus. Lights of airplanes arriving from Asia, and town lights littered like broken glass around the bay and back up the hill. In summer, dance music is borne up on the sea winds from the hotel's beach deck far below. Twist and shout or begin the begin. It's nice to think that somewhere someone is having a good time, and pleasant to picture them down there, turned out, tipsy and flushed in their white shorts and their turquoise shirts. Later, I like to sit and look up at the mythic history of Western civilization, pinpricked and clued through the zodiac. I'd like to be able to name them, say what's what and who got where, curry the physics of metamorphosis and its end game. But I've spent my life knowing nothing.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a position that you know I don't s- I don't really see a lot being taken of saying I don't know, and there's this infinitesimal quality to life itself and an acknowledgement that you know I'm an outsider, or I don't think that way, or I don't go to those places, or I don't feel that way, and I'd like to be able to participate, and yet something's keeping me at arm's length, intellectually or otherwise.
Yeah, and humility's not a bad look, and making art in response to that is one of the best things we can do in uncertainty. And like
Absolutely.
that was one of the best examples I've heard. And I grew up in Orange County too, and so
Oh,
like
really?
I know where he's talking about, and like that's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important poem to me. Yeah.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you. And then yeah, please shout out any recent projects, publications coming out, all that.
Yeah, yeah. I'm still on that contest grind. I've been a finalist a few times recently, so I feel like sometimes you gotta pound your head on the door before you it breaks through the other side. But I'm grateful I have some poems coming out. I just had a poem come out recently in Boulevard. I have a poem coming out this fall in Bennington Review, and I have a couple poems coming out in Southern Indiana Review, I think in the fall. I'm a Google away. Anything that's online is hyperlinked on my website that my students like finding, and
Yeah, yeah. And what was your website again?
I think it's called just colbycottonpoetry.com. Someone had taken colbycotton.com, so I was left to add on that little extra bit of information.
Outstanding. Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Colby. This has been an absolute gift.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Greg. This is awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah. First of many conversations, I'm sure. And yeah, keep it up. And thanks again.
Thank you.